There was a lot of effort that went in to be able to get deer established as a hunting resource. Numbers slowly grew, but then they really took off after the 1990s. And that was because of essentially the collapse of the venison market around Australia. So a lot of deer farms had been set up for venison, and really where deer are located nowadays, apart from in some of the areas of the south east of Australia where that hunting releases happen quite deliberately earlier on, is related to where those venison farms were set up, and when that market collapsed in the 1990s. And the South Australian government did some research recently which showed that after rainfall, proximity to former or current deer farms is the number one predictor of where deer are. But deer are spreading, as you can see, and they essentially are currently concentrated on the east coast of Australia. But the National Feral Deer Action Plan is something that really proud that the Invasive Species Council, and Andrew Cox, our former CEO, was a big driver of this, was very instrumental in getting set up. And this National Deer Plan, which has been a driver of a lot of work nationwide recently, a lot of funding from the federal level and ambition from state level, had three goals. So one of them was essentially to stop the spread of large populations and reduce their impacts. That really is about making sure that where we have these large populations on the East Coast in particular, that they don't start to get into new areas. The second was controlling or eradicating small populations. And the reason for that is where we have less than about 1,000 deer in a contiguous population, geographically isolated to some extent, eradication is entirely possible, particularly with the developments in thermal scopes, aerial shooting, the work that's going on. It is possible to do that while the numbers stay relatively low. Once they get higher, it becomes very difficult to do that. And we don't have particularly good examples of being able to do more than goal 3, which is protect those significant sites. So we've been really focused on that all around the country. And if you go to the next slide, Holly. The primary driver of that work is this map that you'll see here of the National Feral Deer Action Plan. And that splits Australia up into 3 zones. So one of them being the asset protection zone in orange. So that's the area where eradication is pretty difficult. And it's about protecting key areas. So, for example, we've been doing some work with locals and New South Wales government agencies around ensuring that deer don't get into the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area and establish there in big numbers, or some of the work around protecting key high biodiversity areas where deer numbers are quite high. Then there's the containment buffer zone, so that's the green area. And this really is an area where there is a lot of opportunity to absolutely drive down those deer numbers. And the no deer zone is where I guess at the moment there aren't deer. And the aim there for that national plan is to make sure they don't get established. And you'll see something really clear there, which is a line basically from Melbourne, Shepparton, up through central west of New South Wales to Rockhampton. And the easy, I guess, bit of what we're looking to do is to stop the spread of deer west of that line. Because at the moment, we're in a position where that is possible. But if we don't get on top of it, the 6 species of deer in Australia could spread to the entire continent. You can see in that means eradication of deer in South Australia. It means eradication of deer in Western Australia, and down in Tasmania as well. There's this opportunity to stop the spread out of the Midland zone and to control those numbers. Now, that's the current political settings, essentially, of where deer management is at. But there's a couple of issues. One of them is the funding to have that scale of ambition isn't quite there. And in a lot of jurisdictions, there are significant barriers to doing that work. So I'll talk really briefly to New South Wales, because I've been leading that work there. And I guess the opportunity there has been, and our focus there has been on stopping that westward spread. The focus has been on the way that government currently funds feral animal management in New South Wales, which is, as it is in many areas, ad hoc, thinly spread, short term. And that has led us to do some really important work with the Natural Resources Commission in New South Wales, and more recently with the Biosecurity Commissioner, looking at the way to restructure government funding in particular to be much more strategic in terms of what assets are being protected and much more long term. So at the moment, the New South Wales budget a couple of weeks ago or last week, there was $16 million announced for some of this work, which was an increase in the funding of last year, but it's only 1 year's worth of funding. 1 year worth of funding doesn't work essentially when it comes to feral animal management, because it means that the work crews aren't able to be stood up over long periods of time. The time frames are short and tends to go towards just how many animals can you kill rather than what is able to be achieved over a long period of time. So that's been the key focus of our work in New South Wales, after a whole heap of work that the Invasive Species Council and some key community members did to remove the protected status of deer in New South Wales a few years ago, because that was a hamper to control. Now, I'm just going to go now to Reese Pianta, who's our advocacy director. But Reese also is leading our work in Queensland and WA on this issue. And Reese, before you jump into telling us about that work, I'm keen for you to tell us more broadly about the strategy around Invasive Species Council's work on this issue, and also tell us all about the exciting news that you told me this morning about a little campaign win on something we've been working for the last 2 years on.
Yeah, so the strategy building off the National Feral Deer Action Plan that Jack was just telling you about is really, it really has three elements to it. The first is working with governments and jurisdictions, including local governments, to remind them to bring to the fore the policies that can help them implement their commitments under the National Feral Deer Action Plan, which looks like, making sure that there are the resources available, making sure they have the regulatory framework in place and the policy framework to be able to execute feral deer control in their area of responsibility. The second part of that is about the communications. So that is making sure that there's a broad level of public understanding and awareness about the impacts of feral deer and the need to control their numbers because of the risks that they pose, to agriculture, to road users, but very importantly, to nature and to wildlife as a priority. And also as a third part, making sure that the social license of the control tools that we know are most effective is defended. And sometimes that looks like pushing back on coordinated messaging that comes from recreational shooters, which we have seen a concentrated campaign over the last few years to discredit the effective, professional and humane control tools of feral deer. But really encouragingly, and this has been the result of several years' work, we now have a management plan that Gold Coast City Council have just recently released, just recently endorsed, that will see them implement or put in place the resources to implement a plan that will see a 65% reduction in their deer populations every year for the next 5 years. And that's not just a goal that they're pursuing for their council. They're working in conjunction with the other land managers in their area, the state land managers, Transport Corridor, utilities, and their neighbouring councils like Scenic Rim and over the Queensland border in New South Wales in Tweed, where some of the source populations of deer come from. And if you'll recall the map that was just put up a moment ago, Gold Coast City Council is right on the edge of one of the priority eradication zones. Gold Coast City Council, they're the second largest council in Australia. They have the resources to do that kind of project. But when you look at some of the more regional areas, like some of the work that's going on in Alpha and Barcaldine in Queensland, that's priority work to contain the spread of feral deer. And it's reliant on federal government funding that was unfortunately lost in the most recent federal budget. So that's why the work we're doing about reminding governments of their commitments to stay the course on the Feral Deer Action Plan is so important. one of the real great potentials for feral deer control work is some of the pilot eradication projects that are going on in Western Australia. Similarly to Gold Coast, they have very effectively mapped their deer populations. They know where the isolated pockets are, and they've got the control tools like aerial culling with professional shooters backed up by thermal imaging to be able to go in there and achieve the population reduction rates that will, over time, actually result in them being able to pursue an eradication program at each of the locations where their deer populations are. The role we play in WA has been about defending the social license of that project and backing in that work and making it clear to decision makers that this is something worth investing in for the community at large.
Thanks, Reese. And Holly, do you want to put this other slide up because it goes directly to one of the things that Reese had just said there, which is that when we are dealing with invasive species, one of the things that is really important, and in particular for something like deer, is that how you invest matters. And so, one of the issues that was occurring in the Gold Coast, for example, was a couple of staff going out at night, removing a few deer, and essentially doing what people do in a good fishery, which is sustainable harvesting of that species. And so when it comes to deer, really it's about getting up to above at least 35%, but probably you want to be getting up above about 50% reduction of that population every year in order to make sure that there isn't the same number of deer or more next year because of the breeding cycles. And so some great work here that's been done by the Primary Industries Department and some of the landscape boards in South Australia, looking at the difference between the costs of the level of cull that goes on each year. And you can see there in that first graph, a 25% annual cull sees essentially a long-term retention of the same population, ongoing expenditure compared to that 60% annual cull, which costs more upfront and crashes the population that you're then able to maintain it. So that's some of the work that we're doing with governments around the country. And now I want to go to Dr. Tiana Pirtle, who is our lead in Tasmania. And I can see from some of the comments that some of our wonderful Tasmanians who have been supporting us and working with us on the campaign down there have joined us. And Tiana, we just did a whole heap of work that you led with Frontier Economics, looking at the broader costs associated with deer. And so keen for you just to paint us a bit of a picture of what's going on in Tasmania, how the campaign's working, and also how what this report finds and what it shows us for that campaign.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jack. As Jack and Reese have kind of already painted the picture, we know deer can have quite substantial impacts on farming, forestry, anyone driving on the road, the environment. And that's quite well known and anecdotally well established in Tassie. But up until now, we haven't had a statewide quantified assessment of the economic impacts of deer across all those different impacts. And, dollar impacts aren't the end all be all, but when we're talking to governments and government agencies about increasing funding for deer management, it helps to put into context what is currently being lost by not doing enough, which has been the state of play in Tassie for the last few decades. So as Jack said, we worked with Frontier Economics to try and quantify some of those established impacts to give a bit of a cost benefit picture of whether we do something now or continue maintaining the status quo. So that was involved leaning quite heavily on government reports, already published scientific papers, but that only got us so far because there's a bit of a gap in that literature in Tasmania specifically. So we did also work with farming groups, forestry operations, local councils, car insurance, environmental groups, to try and get a picture of what is happening on the ground in terms of the costs they're bearing. And not only is that a key piece in developing a good picture of the cost of deer, but it was also really important for kind of building a shared ownership and shared understanding of the deer situation and shared messaging when we take this report to governments and department and funding agencies. So the highlights reel of the report is deer just in the Midlands and the eastern regions. So we don't have a statewide population number, so we've just estimated the cost where we do know of roughly how many deer there are, and that's in the Midlands and the eastern part of Tassie, and that is most of the deer in Tasmania. So just in that area, we know they're already costing Tasmania more than 53 million a year, and that's quite a conservative estimate for a variety of reasons. And when we consider the fact that the deer population is continuing to increase, which it is because we're not removing enough from the landscape each year, in 30 years' time, those costs could blow out to over nearly 300 million per year. And when we think of those accumulated costs of insufficient action, we're looking at, potentially near 1.4 billion over the next 30 years. And that's a lot of money, especially for a state that doesn't create a lot of revenue. And that's only part of the story because, as I said, it's not the whole state. It's conservative costs because we were leaning heavily on published, already agreed upon data, but also we weren't necessarily able to quantify all the different impacts that deer have. We know deer have an impact on biodiversity and habitat quality, indigenous cultural heritage, and there's biosecurity risks such as foot and mouth disease that would be quite catastrophic if it did get into Tasmania. And we weren't really able to put dollar numbers to that, which basically means that the true cost of Tasmania's deer problem is a lot higher than what we've calculated here. And Holly,
So,
you can go next
so
slide.
Tiana, just briefly for everyone, deer continue to be protected in Tasmania as a hunting resource, and that means that they are not controlled in many of the numbers that are needed, but also that there are a whole heap of restrictions around that control. Can you just talk us briefly through, in terms of the broader campaign beyond this report? I know you've got partnerships with farming and road user groups and are working with the broader politics of Tasmania. Where's that up to, and what's the current focus?
Holly, you can go to the next slide, by the way. Thank you. Yeah, as Jack mentioned, we still protect deer in Tasmania. We're one of two states to do that, and that's mostly the result of a very small but very powerful deer shooting lobby group that has had a chokehold over deer policy for the last few decades and has meant that the government's primary management goal has been to maintain a population of deer that have pretty males with pretty antlers, so people who like trophy shooting can still hunt them. Um, and so we're dealing with this very entrenched view of how to manage deer, and that really does slow down what you're able to do when there are restrictions on who, when, and where you can shoot deer. Um, but we've gotten to a point now where we've so many communities in Tasmania are affected by deer, and they're sick of it, and they're starting to make some noise about it. And that's, farming groups, forestry, people that are hitting deer on the roads. We've seen a 162% increase in the number of deer accidents happening in the last 5 years. Local councils, we've had local councils getting together here to try and put together a bit of a plan about how they're going to tackle deer given the current state of play where they're protected and there's not a lot of government support to deal with it. And that kind of broad coalition of people now all saying the same thing has really started to shift the conversation in Tasmania. There's not very many issues where greenies and forestry and farmers all agree on. So it's quite a powerful message when they're all saying the same thing. And we've kind of shifted the conversation from are there too many deer to okay, everyone agrees there's too many deer now. How are we going to reduce the population? And that's kind of where we're at now is, of course, there's the rhetoric from the shooting lobby group who want recreational hunting, open it up, we'll take care of it. But the science is really clear that patchy, ad hoc ground shooting from people that are just doing their hobby on the weekend doesn't work. We know what works, and that's what's forming some of our asks.
And so, Tiana, I might jump in there and say, point five there on the Central Plateau and the Wilderness World Heritage Area, because that's a pretty good news story in Tasmania in terms of what's been able to be achieved. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that happened?
Yes, so we had the first aerial culling program in Tasmania, on mainland Tasmania for deer, and a lot of that was a result of some of Andrew Cox's work pushing the government to invest in that. We know it's highly effective and humane. The walls of Jerusalem are an extremely remote area. It's pretty much impossible to try and navigate that on foot. And they've functionally eradicated deer from the World Heritage Area, which is great news, and also provides a bit more evidence to what we know works. The helicopter ran for 40 days, operational days, and shot 700 deer. They had some volunteer ground shooters in the same number of operational days, and they only shot 10, which really speaks to that level of effectiveness, especially when we're working in remote areas, rugged areas, which a lot of Tasmania is. And the risk now is we've had this great aerial culling program that was really successful, no adverse outcomes. But of course, the Tasmanian government has relied on the Commonwealth to help fund this. And there's been a gap in that funding, and now we risk losing all that progress because there are still deer in the Midlands, they're protected, and they keep moving into the World Heritage Area.
And I guess to round that out, one of the things that we're also working on, apart from in this jurisdictional level of engagement, is directly with the Commonwealth, and a large part of that is about the Commonwealth providing resources. In the recent budget, federally, there was a significant non-continuation, the government doesn't like calling it a cut, of the established pests and weeds program, which funded a lot of this work in a lot of different states. So we're now working quite closely with the government around their December MyEFO, mid-year economic update, to make sure that ongoing funding goes into those programs and that they're not just stopped, because particularly in some of the smaller states, if the federal government aren't involved, then it's very difficult to get the scale that's required. So thank you so much for that, Tiana. And I can see there's a few questions in the chat there. So thank you, everyone. And we'll get to a few of them towards the end. But I did want to now turn to John Kelly, who is our Victorian advocate. And John, we've been working on deer, the Invasive Species Council and other groups, including the Victorian National Parks Association, have been working on that issue there for a long time because deer continue to be protected in Victoria. And there's, quite a strong hunting lobby group. But this year, we, in the lead up to the Victorian election in November, we launched a new alliance, and that seems to be shifting a lot of conversations and driving a lot of engagement on the issue. Do you want to spell out for us where things are at on the ground in Victoria, and also the campaign that you're leading and working with some of the other environment and agricultural groups on?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I can talk to what we're doing in Victoria. It's a really interesting time. It's been a contested space in terms of deer management and control in Victoria for quite some time. And so it's part of the strategy around trying to shift the narrative on the issue. We've partnered up with the Victorian Farmers Federation, Environment Victoria, the Vic National Parks Association, and a range of other environment and pest management and land management groups in order to build a shared narrative around the kind of work that we need to see in Victoria. We in Victoria, like Tasmania, have the absurd situation where we protect feral deer rather than protect communities and people from the impacts of feral deer. And so that's led to a situation where we now have the largest population of feral deer in Australia. There are up to 1 million animals in the Victorian environment, and they've essentially been given a free pass to do whatever they want. And the impact of that are profound. We are seeing deer that are transforming the landscape in parts of Victorian forests. You can go to places where the forest has been really fundamentally changed because these deer are destroying all the undergrowth species and taking what was cool temperate rainforest and turning it into more open forest as they destroy the undergrowth and spread other invasive weedy species that become fuel load for further for forest fires in the future. The impact of these animals and their spread across the state is becoming an issue that people can't ignore. We're seeing increasing interactions on the roads with deer. We're seeing deer increasingly impacting on farms and horticultural businesses. I've spoken to people who have experienced $1 million losses because of deer. Spoken to people who are seeing tens of thousands of dollars year on year of losses, people who have had to sell their family farm that's been in their family for generations because they can't deal with the impacts of deer. And the situation is driven by this protected status that we have in Victoria, which protects deer in order for them to be retained as a hunting resource for people to enjoy their hobby on the weekends. And the impact on communities where deer are a daily presence is really profound. And because it's become such a large issue, there is a widespread call for action, a widespread desire for something to change. And so we've been going out, talking to people in communities, getting their feedback, hearing their stories. We're talking about those stories in the media and sharing them with politicians and power brokers in order to try and get them to understand that this is not an issue that they can ignore. It's an issue that people feel very strongly about. They're having to deal with the impacts of these animals on their own. Large numbers of people across regional Victoria in
Oh,
particular
I think, John,
who feel that
unfortunately,
they are essentially with very little active support from.
oh, I think we're losing you
Sorry, Jack.
in terms of reception there, I'm afraid. So I might just jump in and then come back to you.
Have you
And
got
so
me?
we'll just keep going, John. So
Sure.
the and I might step in just also to say in terms of where we're at in Victoria, those impacts are obviously compounding. The level of awareness within the community is growing. But one of the key things that John has been involved with is a partnership that we've set up with Environment Victoria. So John's position actually sits within Environment Victoria, works with the Invasive Species Council, and also we've set up an alliance with the Victorian Farmers Federation. So similar to in Tasmania, where the work that Tiana's been doing with farming groups, this is one of these ones that cuts across some of the traditional divides on some of these issues. And in the lead up to the Victorian election in November, we are using deer both as a direct opportunity for all sides of politics to look at a different way of approaching the issue, both in terms of that protected status and wider sort of perception of deer among some politicians as just a hunting resource, but also some really concrete asks there around eradicating deer from Western Victoria. So if we remember back to that map that I shared at the start, there is this opportunity in Western Victoria to eradicate deer. Most of the populations are small, isolated, and with government investment, that will make a huge difference to the management of landscapes in Western Victoria. And it takes me across to James Johnston, who is our South Australian advocate, as well as leading some of our work in the federal parliament as well. But one of the key opportunities that we see with eradication in Western Victoria is because the ambition of the South Australian government is so high around eradication that really we could imagine a deer-free zone from Melbourne to the West Coast if the Western Australian government and the South Australian government follow through on the ambition that they've shown. So, James, do you want to tell us just a little bit about where things are at in South Australia, but also the work that you've been doing to support, because the government's already on board such an ambitious goal? What's needed there?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. South Australia has certainly been leading the nation on feral deer management. We are the first jurisdiction to have a full statewide eradication program. I regularly like to remind my colleagues of this. In some ways, it makes my job easier here in South Australia, but it is certainly not a walk in a deer-free park. We have feral deer in South Australia. It's a significant problem, pretty much for the bottom half of the state. So most of that population is in the southeast, and then we have some in the Adelaide Hills and ranging in that sort of bottom half of the state. We currently have a population of about 40,000. And the eradication program is working really well. We've gotten through about 29,000 of those, but obviously that population fluctuates as they breed, but we're certainly on the trajectory downwards. These programs are split into two. So we've got the general eradication program, which involves aerial culling, clearly the most effective and efficient approach to knocking down populations. But then we also have the peri-urban eradication program in the Adelaide Hills, in those more sort of sensitive urban environments, with professional ground shooters that go in at night and work with landholders to get those populations down. So we're certainly unique in South Australia. The legislative hurdles other jurisdictions have, we just don't have that here in SA. Not only are they a declared pest, but the government is actively removing those populations from the landscape. Really, our goal as the Invasive Species Council here in South Australia is twofold. So maintaining the program is really important. It isn't fully funded. So at the moment, both state and federal government are taking almost a year-on-year approach to this to this program, which means that it's a constant level of advocacy from us. For example, at the state election that was just in March here in South Australia, we were pushing for the state government to fund their half of the program fully. Unfortunately, they didn't come to the table and do that, but they did give some bridging funding for a year's worth of funding. So we're advocating to the state and federal government to get that funding over the line. But the other part of the work that we do is maintaining that social license. So ensuring the general public are aware of this program and the importance of it. There's a couple of examples of how we do that, mostly through media engagement. So, for example, in the Riverland, where we only have a small pocket of deer population, we had a sambar deer pop up in the middle of that region. And so we did a lot of advocacy with the local landscape board there, raising the awareness of it. Obviously, a sambar deer is massive. It's essentially a cow-sized deer, which is causing a lot of potential risk to community up there on top of the environmental and agricultural risk. But in other ways, we're pushing the government to go further and seize opportunities. So in Deep Creek, our iconic national park down on the Fleurieu Peninsula, we had a bushfire go through there in February, do a lot of damage, but the silver lining of that is it removed a lot of the canopy cover, and it was an opportunity for the state government to seize, and we've been pushing the government to do this, to go in and make the most of that opportunity while the canopy's not there. You can go in and take the deer out and push the benchmark down for those populations. So my main concerns going forward in South Australia is that ongoing funding, number one. It's also ensuring that eradication program in the peri-urban areas is achieved, because it's a lot harder than the aerial culling that is occurring. But also, when we don't see many deer left or achieve effective eradication, that we don't just call it a day. We want to get to actual eradication, and that's really the goal of this program. So I certainly feel the pressure to get that. It is a nation-leading program, and we want to be that beacon of hope that gets replicated elsewhere.
Thank you very much. And the commitment and fortitude of the South Australian government across all sides of politics and within the department has been a real driving factor of the success there. It's hard to understate how important an active bureaucracy is on these issues. Often we find that there is a sense of despair or having already given up within bureaucracy, and we're sort of having to motivate their energy. In South Australia, we are absolutely partners with ministers, with opposition, with bureaucracy on this issue, which is very refreshing. But it's pretty important for us to be there on some of those broader social license issues. I'm going to go across now to Nicola Barton, who is our head of our comms and media. And there's a few questions I see that sort of lead into this. I see one from Karen asking about her 93-year-old mother thinking deer were a native animal, and some of that broader issues. I can see there's some questions in the chat around, why can't we just eat the problem more broadly? So some of these things are what we're often up against. Nicola, do you want to talk us through? But before we go to that, I might just chuck up one slide, Holly. Could you put that one up for me? Because I think it's really powerful demonstration of one of the issues. So, just the last slide on my presentation. The different states. Thank you. So this one I often like to put up as well, which to me is a good representation of the consistency with which some of the hunter lobby groups who don't want to see deer removed, and some who are actively pushing to see deer protected. And for a great example for everyone, only 2 days ago, New Zealand decided that control was no longer allowed in any of their national parks, because they were now essentially turning their national parks into game parks, and the aerial control was too successful. And so there was a move in the New Zealand Parliament which successfully stopped any aerial control in national parks there, and turned it over to just hunting groups. This to me shows you, in every state in the country, the same messages are being pushed around aerial culling being dangerous, aerial culling being barbaric, aerial culling being needing to stop. And the reason for that is the success of aerial culling, particularly with the development of thermal scopes and the way that's being used, is meaning that in a lot of areas, as we've been saying, feral deer control and eradication is increasingly possible. And so that is a direct threat to groups that want to keep feral deer out in that landscape. So Nicola, do you want to talk to us more broadly? What are the issues that we're facing in this space, and how are we dealing with it?
Yeah, I mean,
we can take that slide off if we want.
Yeah. Unfortunately, good science doesn't automatically lead to good policy, and if it did, we wouldn't all be sitting here tonight. But fundamentally, what we know is that if governments are going to take action, we need to build the social and political circumstances in which it's possible for them to do so, right? And that is why media has become such a core, critical part of our advocacy function. Because it's not just where we can drive awareness, it's where we can build social license, building acceptance of control methods like aerial culling, like shooting, difficult conversations to have in the community, right? And intuitively, it's often hard for people to understand these issues. They love Bambi. They think we can eat the problem and we can answer questions about that later, or that non-lethal control methods are enough to meet with the scale of demand. And that's why our work has become so important in a media landscape, because it's where we build awareness and acceptance of the methods that work, and it's where we're able to put pressure on governments that really enable us to shift what is politically possible, right? It's taking something taboo and misunderstood, and turning it into something that becomes an expectation for governments to deliver on, political agenda setting, essentially. Now that doesn't come easy. It comes with carefully considered messaging, and we've done a bunch of social research on how to talk about these issues in the media and gain that acceptance. And repeating those over and over and over again, sharing the science in a digestible way, and for that messaging to not just be coming from us, right? Coming from allies, coming from our stakeholders, community champions, governments, all sharing notes, all sharing the same messaging over and over and over again. Because we know that there are, well-organized, well-resourced, sometimes straight up fierce opponents that are actively trying to undermine this work. And, if you leave a vacuum, someone else will fill it. And so if we aren't proactively telling these stories about why deer management matters, sharing the science, others will happily tell a different story, and they will dominate that narrative. And so for us, social license, it's not something we win and keep forever. You have to keep reinforcing it, responding to misinformation, reminding people of the science and why this work matters. And so a lot of that too, I'm noticing lately, is becoming the re-education of journalists in that process. There's such a churn and burn turnover in newsrooms at the moment. There's, gutting of newsrooms, less resourcing. So it's not just about educating and bringing the public along on that journey. It's re-educating the media landscape as well. So just this month, we've done over 1,000 media stories, which is more than any other ENGO in the country. And, in my opinion, that's still not enough. That's the level that we need to create the cultural shifts that are required in this space for change. So much of our communications approach is actually just about speed and volume. And that's often what sets us apart from other organizations, because, you can't get bogged down in beautifully graphically designed communications pieces that go through 18 levels of approval before they get out. It's really about being fast and, having relationships, picking up the damn phone and making it happen, and doing that over and over again. And in the process of that as well, it's about amplifying the voices of others, right? We're always telling the stories of the people on the ground, the impacted landholder or the person who hit a deer on a freeway. How do we keep repackaging that messaging to bring Australians on the journey and create that momentum for change, essentially?
Thank you, Nicola. Now, I'm going to jump into some of the questions that people have asked. So if you want to put any in that Q&A, I'm going to talk to some of them now. And I can see one here from, it's just jumped straight off my... People just put new questions in, it jumped off. But one here from Sue Ellen Smith asking about when feral deer and other pest animals are shot and are they left for scavengers to eat? Is there an issue around that? So this is something we do hear a lot, and it's something that I think a lot of people from good reason feel needs to be addressed, which is carcass management. What happens in the landscape if you're killing large numbers of feral animals, whether it's the horses in Kosciuszko National Park, whether it's pig and deer culls, regardless, if you're killing large numbers, does that have flow-on impacts? And so the answer to that is, and are there better ways to manage it? The answer to that is it is very difficult to undertake large-scale culls at the level that is required to get above the population growth rate in broad landscapes, and then to go around and pick those carcasses up and move them. In best practice is actually leaving those carcasses in situ where they break down, just as if an animal died in the forest, it would be left in situ and break down. That can have concentrated potential impacts, which relatively minor, but can mean that you've got other scavengers building up, or that there could be potential if there's too many needed watercourses for that to have impacts on water quality in a short term. So that's something that does need to be managed by people when they're undertaking that control work, but it is a short term impact when you're talking about an effective control program that crashes those numbers down and then maintains them at a lower level. We also know in a lot of landscapes, taking them out actually does have nutrient impacts, particularly in those alpine landscapes. And we do encourage governments to undertake integrated pest management, so to be doing that work, controlling for other pest animals at the same time. I mean, we are talking a lot about deer here, and the reason we're talking about deer is because there are still real opportunities to stop that spread of deer in a way that, for example, for a lot of pig populations, that's pretty difficult. But we shouldn't be undertaking, single species only control programs without looking at some of the broader issues. Another question I have, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, Tiana, someone's asking about Maria Island and whether there are deer issues down there. I know obviously that's where the Tasmanian devils and there's cat issues there, but do you know?
Yeah, no deer on Maria. We've got them on Bruny Island and King Island. But yeah, the invasive mammal issue on Maria is cats, and I know the state government is currently undertaking some cat eradication programs on Maria Island, is included in that.
And Tiana, do you want to just talk briefly to the broader opportunity around islands and some of that work there?
With deer or
deer in general.
So I guess in Tassie we're in a really fortunate position in that we are an island and we have a lot of offshore islands, and it's very well established that islands are really kind of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to invasive species eradications. Once you get rid of the animals, then you don't have to worry about that constant migration in like you do when you're eradicating from areas on a continuous landscape on the mainland. And so Bruny Island and King Island both have quite small populations of deer, so very, very feasible to eradicate. And once you do that, close down all the deer farms that are there, because that's how they got there in the first place. And then you basically don't have to deal with the issue for ongoing into the future. And that's definitely one of our key campaign goals is really see that eradication happening on Bruny Island and King Island. We also have lots of peninsulas that function a bit similarly. The Tasman, Freycinet, you can also very effectively eradicate deer from those areas.
Excellent. And so there's a couple of questions here, John. One asking, is there any main Victoria party that we expect to take protections off deer? And another one asking, what should we as landholders be doing to try and get the protected status of deer in Victoria changed?
So we're talking to all parties at the upcoming state election about their policies around deer and strongly encouraging people to understand that the impact of this protected status actually has on communities. And through that advocacy, we're getting some traction and we're starting to get a response from politicians. People are interested in hearing from us about what we're seeing and hearing, and they're interested in understanding the community impact and how these barriers that are produced by the protected status actually stop people doing effective deer control. So we know for people like land care groups that they can't access funding to do deer control in Victoria. because of the protected status of these animals and because they're not considered to be a pest. So at every stage of the process, there are a series of barriers that are created by the protected status and by the kind of culture that we have around deer in Victoria, where they are seen as being a resource to protect, to ensure that there are numbers there for people to enjoy long term. And because there's so many of them, that's having such a significant impact. I mean, we're now seeing them turn up in the suburbs of Melbourne. We're seeing them wandering down the main street of Fitzroy and walking down the street in Thornbury. So these animals are on the move and they are having an increasingly prevalent presence, which puts them front of mind for the whole community. And that means politicians need to act. They need to be seen to act. And there's an expectation, particularly in deer affected communities like the one where I live, that we're going to see some kind of strong commitments around deer control at this upcoming state election. And so the work I'm doing is trying to encourage people to come up with those. And one of the things that we're strongly advocating for at the moment is to introduce some of the missing pieces from our deer control plans that we have in Victoria. That means empowering communities to be able to take on the deer problem and employ people to act as community facilitators who can help people in communities where deer are a constant presence and having a massive impact on people's lives and businesses, that they can work with these people to identify ways of doing deer control in a way that's meaningful and effective. So we're calling politicians to actually come to the party and say, we're here to support communities rather than support the kind of lobby group that is interested in maintaining the status quo.
Thanks, John. And I can see there's a question in there, James, around some of the different species of deer and a reference to the recent discovery of elk in South Australia. Do you want to just talk to that that broader issue we're seeing with different species turning up in different areas and what that means?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Yeah, look, certainly we have some pretty standard species of deer in South Australia. So we have the fallow deer and the red deer. But for us to see elk and sambar pop up in South Australia, it really raises the question for us as to how they got there. And certainly not going to cast any dispersions on or accusations, but it does raise the question, and our role as the Invasive Species Council is to certainly raise that with the government and ensure that we are getting on top of those populations before they establish further. One deer is okay, but if we start to see a population of sambar or elk in South Australia, that can be really problematic.
Excellent. And yeah, we certainly have seen, unfortunately, recently, hog deer turning up a long, long way from hog deer populations in Victoria and central New South Wales. And these things don't turn up by accident. So there is a constant battle there. Tiana, I don't know if you can answer this question, and then we might finish up because it's 7 o'clock. But there's a question just here about the 700 kills from aerial shooting and the 10 volunteers on the ground. And the control effectiveness of different types of effort. Are you able to talk to that more broadly and some of the the different control effectiveness?
Can you read the question for me? I don't know where it is in the
Oh,
chat.
sorry. No, you reported 700 kills from aerial shooting and 10 from volunteers on the ground. Was there an equivalent level of effort? Can you talk about control effectiveness of different types of effort?
Yeah, so that was controlled for in those operational days, which they calculate for per person per hour effort. And when you compare those, the helicopter and the ground shooting, the aerial culling was just so much more effective. And that is because the walls of Jerusalem area is very remote. It's a very low density deer population, so they were really hard to find. Despite best efforts, I think one of the volunteer shooters tried really hard and he didn't find a single deer. So really challenging environment to be operating on foot ground shooting. Obviously, aerial culling isn't appropriate everywhere, so the effectiveness depends on the conditions, the landscape. In peri-urban areas here, there's been some success with trapping, which obviously isn't very useful in other landscapes where you have lots of deer. Trapping a few deer at a time isn't very effective. So that answers the
Excellent.
question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I guess one of the things that when it comes to control effectiveness, often it gets reported as just how many were killed and how much hours went into it. But really, it's about density is a really important function of that. As any invasive species gets down into lower densities, the cost goes up significantly. But that's a really important expense to be doing, because often it is when we have the lowest numbers of species of an invasive species that we should be doing the greatest amount of effort. One of the things we often talk to politicians about and in the media is that too often no one cares about invasive species until everyone cares. And then sometimes that's too late. So one of our challenges is getting governments, communities to be worried about this before it has become an established and entrenched issue. So I'm going to wind up there. I can see there's a whole heap more questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all in the hour. Hopefully that gave you a bit of a whirlwind and fast-paced tour of some of the work we're doing all over the country on this issue. It's only one of the many issues the Invasive Species Council is working on, and obviously us being a bold, independent and active voice on this issue depends on all the people who support us. So I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been listening, who are big supporters of the Invasive Species Council. Your donations power the work of this broader staff group on deer, but also on bird flu and fire ants and biosecurity risk insurance reform and cat eradication on Kangaroo Island, and a huge breadth of things that we're engaged on. And anyone who hasn't yet had the chance to support us, there's a great opportunity to do so ahead of the financial year. Keep us being bold, independent advocates who bring communities together, catalyse action from governments, and make sure that we have the funding and the focus and the ambition to really get on top of these invasive species. So I'm sure Holly will chuck in the chat a link that you can all go to, but if you can't see that link, then I think you go to our website and there'll be a donate link right up the top. But we absolutely depend on that work so that we can stay fierce and independent. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate so many people joining us in the evening.